Hey guys, what's up? My name is Kat. A lot of you may know me from my Facebook page. I have my own group, Kat's Journey Through CML, where I share my experience with having chronic myelogenous leukemia, and I've decided that I'm going to start sharing videos on YouTube as well. This past week, I started sharing videos on Instagram, and last week I started sharing videos on TikTok, and I figured it's time that maybe I start branching out and doing videos on YouTube as well. I did consider it like last year or 2 years ago, and I figured that maybe it'd be too much work, but given that I'm not working right now, I figured, hey, I have the time, so why not? So without further ado, I'm just going to get into who I am, what I have, and so on and so forth. So, again, hello, I'm Kat, and I have what's called chronic myelogenous leukemia, or CML, and today I'm here to explain to you what it is, what it does, and so on and so forth. Um, I'm going to try to just keep it real simple today because it is a lot of information. I will do other videos later on down the road about how to treat it and other information like side effects, stuff like that, my other disorder, and so on and so forth. But today it's more about a background of me and what CML is. So, anyway, I was diagnosed at the age of 19, which is pretty rare considering CML usually is diagnosed at or around the age of 50. However, nowadays people are getting diagnosed younger and younger. There is no true reason or research about why. There also is no true known cause for CML. It is not known as a genetic disease. However, some people are starting to think that there are environmental causes for it, but there is no absolute research on that. I was adopted, so there is no family history to go off of. Even so, again, it is not really known as a genetic disease. I found mine through a slew of sinus infections. I'll give you that story in a minute, but first I want to define what CML is. CML, again, chronic myelogenous leukemia, is an extremely rare form of leukemia. It is not the type of leukemia that people often think about when they hear that word. Usually they associate leukemia with what's called AML, acute myelogenous leukemia, and oftentimes people associate that with childhood leukemia, and they usually think about like intravenous chemo or chemo through a port, and usually people in the hospital who are very, very sick with like no hair and they're vomiting and they have to go for treatments regularly in the hospital. This leukemia is very, very different. We don't do that. We take pill forms of chemo, which I'll probably talk about that in a whole separate video because that's a really long description and it takes a lot of time to talk about that and teach about that. But again, I just want to break down about what CML is and tell you guys my story. So CML is, again, like very, very different. A lot of cancers start somewhere else in the body and make their way to the bone marrow, whereas this one starts in the bone marrow and makes its way out. It is not something caused by like a tumor or a growth. It is actually caused by something called a translocation of chromosomes. So your chromosomes meet up or match up to make your genetic coding. Like I mentioned, something called a translocation happens where the chromosomes kind of get confused and they mix up where they're not supposed to. In this case, specifically chromosomes 9 and 22 link up and they end up causing something called the Philadelphia chromosome, which is known as the BCR-ABL1 gene. And that's what causes these immature white blood cells to be pushed out into the bone marrow. They're called blastocytes. And in later phases of the disease, they get pushed out into the bloodstream, and that's where they can be spread out into other areas of the body and cause more issues. So that's what causes this cancer. There is, again, no known cause for what causes that translocation. It just kind of happens. We don't really know why. There are other mutations that create different forms and issues with this disease, that have different transcripts. I don't have any memorized off the top of my head, but BCR-ABL1 is like textbook CML. And that's what I have, thankfully. Well, not thankfully, but I'm thankful that I don't have any mutations. So basically, to put it in layman's terms, and this is how somebody described it to me, chromosomes 9 and 22 were having an affair, and they hooked up and had a baby, the BCR-ABL1 gene. and because of that, we happened. CML happened. We're a product of their affair. And it shouldn't have happened. We're the mistake that happened that night. And it's like a weird way of looking at it, but unfortunately it kind of makes sense. But anyway, so like how I mentioned to you guys before, normal leukemia is treated with intravenous chemo through an IV, a port, whatever. We take oral chemo, which I'll talk about in a different video. So anyway, how I found my CML is interesting. So I was away at school in college. I was studying music therapy. I was 6 hours away from home, and I was having recurring sinus infections, 5 specifically, and I was on several courses of antibiotics and a course of prednisone, which is a steroid. Now, if you guys are familiar with prednisone in any way, shape, or form, it makes your body hyperactive. It jacks up your heart rate, it jacks up your blood pressure, it makes your body just super active and speeds up every homeostatic process that's going on in your body. I emphasize that because it is very important to the story. So while I was away at school, I went to the nurse practitioner on campus because I just wasn't feeling well. So I went there, she did some lab work, and she calls me back to see her, and she tells me, you need to call your mom. Again, 6 hours away from home. And I'm like, okay. I was 19 at the time, so technically I wasn't pediatric, but she still wanted me to call my mother. So I did. And my mom was a school nurse at the time. She's retired now. So she was busy at work, taking care of kids. I didn't really want to bother her, but, the nurse made it sound urgent, so I called her anyway. And the nurse had me put it on speaker, and she goes, all right, you have no vitamin D in your system. I'm like, okay. Is that it? And she was like literally no vitamin D. I'm like, all right, whatever, I'll just take supplements. And she goes, there's something else. And I'm like, all right. She goes, you have immature white blood cells in your blood, blastocytes. And I'm like, all right, what does that mean? She's like, well, it could be indicative of a serious blood disorder or even a leukemia. And I was like, wait a minute. I was like, leukemia? I'm like, cancer? That leukemia? She was like, yeah, you need to see a specialist right away. So I was like, okay. So the only person that was with me at the time was my girlfriend. So I went to see a specialist, again, 6 hours away from home. My mother wasn't with me, just my girlfriend. And I went to see a hematologist/oncologist, or HEMOC is what they're referred to. And CML is tricky. You're not going to find it unless you're looking for it. And obviously we weren't looking for it. So I went to the HEMOC, and because I had an infection, and because I did have CML that we didn't know about, my labs were all over the place. And she was like, well, I don't see anything crazy. I just see signs that you have an infection. And I'm like, well, I know that, it's pretty obvious. But then the immature white blood cells disappeared, or they lessened. So I went there twice, and she was like, well, it could be the prednisone that's pushing out the immature white blood cells from your bone marrow into your blood. Which makes sense. Like I said before, steroid makes your body hyperactive and speeds up processes, and there you go. So it could have been that my bone marrow was being forced to push out immature white blood cells faster than it should have been. So that made sense. And they wanted me to come back a third time, but because that made sense, I was like, I'm not going to bother. So also at the time, I was dealing with some mental health issues. I do have an eating disorder as well. And to make a very long story short, I did have to medically withdraw from school. And I went to an eating disorder facility, inpatient, in New Canaan, Connecticut, Silver Hill Hospital, and that place was wonderful. But I ended up getting pneumonia out of nowhere. Granted, I am prone because I have had pneumonia before. This was literally out of nowhere. Like, I was healthy one day, and then the next day I had pneumonia. So, I healed perfectly. And then when I came home, my mom, being a nurse, she was like, well, I think we should see one more doctor. So I did. I went to Crystal Run Healthcare in Nanuet in Rockland County, New York, and that's where I saw my first HEMOC, Dr. Ravi Shah, and he is still a big factor in my life today. He still acts as one of my HEMOCs for a different reason, for my clotting disorder, which I'll get to that in a whole separate video. Today it's just CML. But I love him. He is like I love him so much. He's wonderful. But anyway, so I went to go see him, and he spent so much time with us. He looked through all of my lab work, all my paperwork, all my history. He asked me questions, we asked him questions, and ultimately he looked at my abnormal white cells and the immature white cells, and he goes, all right, I'm going to test you for an extremely rare cancer. I don't think you have it, but we're going to test anyway. He's like, you're asymptomatic. The only thing I was having at the time were night sweats and weakness, which we attributed to my eating disorder and getting used to eating again. But we tested for CML anyway. And the way you test for CML is called a PCR, polymerase chain reaction test. Again, looking for that BCR-ABL1 gene. It is a blood test, and it takes 2 weeks. So we did that blood test. We waited the dreadful 2 weeks, as I call it, the pesky PCR. And he was like, I don't think you're going to have it. And I said, well, what are the next steps if we do? And he kind of wrote it off. He was like, don't worry, because you're not going to have it. So 2 weeks later, we got a call on the answering machine, you need to come back in. And I was like, no way. So you go back in, and he was like, you have it. And I was like, wow, really? He goes, yeah. And he's like, the next steps, bone marrow biopsy. And I was like, okay. So I'll talk about that in a separate video, because that's a whole other ball game too. But we did that. We confirmed the CML. And because I was so young with CML, I was 19, he didn't know how to treat pediatric CML, because in CML world, that is considered pediatric. He wanted to start me on Gleevec, which is a first-generation TKI, or tyrosine kinase inhibitor. That's the oral chemo that we take to treat the CML. So he referred me to Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. And that's where I met my team. I met like a world-renowned specialist in leukemia and lymphoma, Dr. Richard O'Reilly. And this is like really funny, because he was like close to 80 years old, if not 80. And he came in with like a walker and hunched over, and I was like, wait a minute, is this guy my doctor? But it was actually honestly like breathtaking to meet him, because I was like, oh my god, this guy's like a legend. And then this really, really young guy came in, or maybe he wasn't as young to me, but like he seemed young standing next to this guy. But he ended up being my actual oncologist, Dr. Christopher Forlenza. He was his understudy. And I guess that's what you call them, understudy, or is that just like in like show business? I don't know, prodigy, whatever you call it. So anyway, because I was considered pediatric, I was followed by the leukemia and lymphoma team. Because they were leukemia and lymphoma, my team was bigger. So I had like 5 to 6 nurse practitioners. I had several nurses. I had a pharmacist. I had a social worker. So my team was huge. So like if I had to message somebody always answered. Like there was always somebody available. So I was followed by them for about 5.5 years. I just recently got kicked out of their team and sent to an adult team, but I'm followed by a CML specialist, Dr. Michael Morrow. He's wonderful. I love him too. But anyway, we went with Sprycel, which is actually a second-generation TKI. The big argument was, do we go with Gleevec, which is first generation, less side effects, but possibly a slower response, or do we go with Sprycel, which is a second generation, more side effects, but quicker response? So that was the argument. My numbers were around 44%, which, you know, they weren't incredibly high, but they also weren't low. So it was a question of, do we want a quicker response or slower response with less side effects? And we ended up going with Sprycel, which was the quicker response and possibly more side effects. Again, I'll talk to you guys later about my medications in a separate video, because there's a huge history behind that. But I'm really grateful that we went with that decision, because I achieved what's called MMR, Major Molecular Remission and Response, within about 1.5 years. And, you know, my team at Sloan and my new team at Sloan have been wonderful since then. So that's a little bit about me. I just wanted to introduce myself, give you a little bit about my story. Um, so far, it's been great. You know, I have troubles with my medications. It's been a rough road, but I love sharing my story. I'm glad that I'm branching out onto YouTube. And if you guys want to follow me, I do have my new videos now on TikTok. My name there is CatCoco13, KATCOCO, and the number 13. And it's the same on Instagram, actually. I just started doing live videos there. I look forward to sharing my story with you guys. And then I'll put the name of my Facebook group in the description. If you guys can follow me, that'd be fantastic. I am trying to get monetized on Facebook. I have 730 followers on Facebook. I have to get to 1,000 so I can like be sent stars and stuff, and that would just be great. But overall, I just want to start sharing awareness of CML. I feel like there's not enough knowledge, especially for people who are younger. I started my group originally to share awareness of CML in younger people because it was so rare at the time for somebody my age to be diagnosed. Dr. Shaw, my original hemoc, told me that 3% of people my age at that time that had cancer had CML, and my mind was like blown. You know, people ask me like, how did I react when I was diagnosed? And honestly, at the time, I was not all too surprised since I was being worked up for the first time when I was away at school for leukemia. So when I got the final diagnosis, I was kind of like, okay, you know, this is what they were expecting the first time around. So it was kind of like almost relieving to finally have like an answer. Um, but obviously it's not fun. But it is good to know what's going on and being able to treat it. So again, thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for following. I do have 3 things that I always say in my descriptions. I have 3 hashtags. My first one is do what you think you can't do. My second one is munch me cancer. And my third one is the name of my group, which is Cat's Journey Through CML. A lot of people ask me about munch me cancer. It is basically a nicer way of saying bite you cancer or F you cancer. So I think it's cute to say munch me cancer. So there you guys go. And I end every video with saying do what you think you can't do. So again, thank you guys. Have a wonderful day and do what you think you can't do. Bye.